Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for SF Doc Fest, the 20th anniversary. Today, we're here to talk about our shorts program number 4, See Me. If you're logging in through the digital space, thank you so much and welcome. Also, this screening will be live and in person at the beloved Roxy Theater on June 6th at 4:30 p.m. So if you're around, I hope that you're able to join us. Thank you to our filmmakers who are all here to share their stories with us. We have joining us Lee Cox with Truth and Reconciliation, Brandon Haynes with Legacy, Joseph Fletcher with Moving Mediation, ETA with Confluence, Irene Gustafson and Joelle Yates with Reimagining the City as Your Own. Thank you so much for joining us today for this special Q&A. Just to kind of kick things off, I was hoping that we could talk about where each of you kind of found the inspiration for your films. And I would love to start with ETA.
Sure. So Confluence was a series of showcases that I curated in 2019 for AAPI Heritage Month. And at that time, I was putting on shows around LA, and there were a lot of spaces that didn't have a lot of representation, especially within the AAPI community. So when I put on these showcases, I decided to document them and shoot them in slow-mo. And I thought that was a great medium to also share anecdotes and stories about some of the participants' ancestry and their thoughts and reflections on identity. So Confluence is a short doc about queer identity and AAPI identity, and something that I tried to make more meditative and nonlinear and non-Western, so as to reference back to my ancestral uh, energy. And it's something that hopefully people can watch and be calmed by and to fall asleep to.
Thank you so much. Brandon, would you like to speak about Legacy?
Sure. So for me, Legacy came about out of multiple layers of frustration. With the pandemic happened, productions, being able to go out and shoot became something that was very limited. And it made me stir crazy and wanting to be able to create, but not being able to have the outlets to do so. So I was very restless to create. And on top of that, we had the whole George Floyd incident happened. And within that incident, the protesting, just seeing all that happening on top of the pandemic, it was just frustration. And I wanted to do something more than protest. And I felt that my way of shedding light on the subject matter would be through film. So it was me pondering ways of how I can create something which would show the humanity of who we are as people, Black people, and champion us in a way. And then I came across Mark as his photos went viral. His photos of the Trump towers within a day, it was over 1 million views. It was being printed on posters in Germany, T-shirts. It was the image of a movement, essentially. So I reached out to him and just had a conversation with him and asked, would you be open to me documenting it? He said, me? I guess. And from that point, it was a journey. Getting to know him better, his process, his strengths, his pains, the good and the bad that came with this new transition in his life, as the spotlight essentially came on him. Like, who was this guy who took the photo? Yeah.
Lovely. I think that there's something interesting, especially in this time where we have so much mediation and access to the creation of media, that capturing in and of itself is kind of an act of protest, which I think we really see in this program, where we're turning the lens on ways to stand against hate. And in some cases, turning the lens on ourselves, which leads me to Lee. Could you please speak about your film?
Thank you. And probably similar to Brandon to some extent, my film really came from frustration and concern. The night after Trump was elected, I say he grabbed power and I grabbed my video camera, and I went down to Frank Ogawa Plaza in Oakland and started filming an early protest with a lot of some of the second iteration, probably of Black Lives Matter and Occupy and other folks. People were pretty appalled and distressed, and I just continued doing it. And I'd filmed at that point, it's more than 60 marches, rallies, and demonstrations in the Bay Area mostly, and also Washington, D.C. It was really my way of reflecting what was going on and inspiring people to stay active and resist. And in January of 2020, I got a grant to make a video about me making all these videos. And it wasn't really a vanity piece, it was to inspire folks to vote. So we were able to make a 5-minute version of the mini doc, and it was viewed more than 20,000 times on social media. And the message was, vote like your life depends on it. So I'm very proud of that. And the 11-minute version has a lot more about me and my life and early activism, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama as a gay child, and all those different pieces coming together to where we are now.
Thank you so much. I think there's also really something special to talk about creative collaboration and the power of amplification, which we definitely see in moving mediation. Joseph, do you want to speak about your film and your collaboration with Eric Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give a little bit of a background, I've always kind of been drawn to action sports. I've found them to be a sort of outlet to find peace in my life, to skill build, and grew up skateboarding and skiing and doing a lot of things that I saw as just leisure activities when I was younger. But this process of making this film, Moving Meditation, has kind of led me to understand them as more as kind of crucial roles that we have in our lives to find, peace. So basically, Eric found me on the BART train. I was skateboarding, and he's a skateboarder, so he came up to me, struck up a conversation. He's a very eloquent, well-spoken individual, and we started just working together filming, because that's what a lot of action sports films come out of. They just come out of time spent together shooting and seeing what you get. And I was struck by his just philosophy on life and his drive, his relentless drive to continue to skateboard well into his 30s. He was almost 40 years old when we started working on this project. And I think the initial basis of the film was, what compels someone to keep doing something that they love, even as their body starts to kind of defy them. And that's when Eric opened up to me about his story, that in 2007, he had been subjected to police brutality, where he was almost put in jail for 13 years for defending himself. And it quickly became apparent that his whole purpose of skateboarding, it allows him to access something that he was robbed of when he was younger. And it also allows him to heal and to kind of make sense of his own place in the world. So that quickly became kind of like the center of the documentary. Eric voiced his interest in wanting to share that story, and we just had a lot of archival footage because he was a professional skateboarder. He had been skating for the past 20 years. So luckily I was able to access a lot of that archival footage, and Eric's in the process of launching this application that's kind of like an Airbnb for skateboarders, that they can go anywhere in the world and they can tune in and find skate spots and skate community. And it just seemed to be this like really important result of that trauma that he had gone through, where he had set out to actually make the world a more equitable and democratic place in its public spaces. So that's kind of how it came about. And yeah, it seemed like a super relevant topic, especially given everything that's going on, but also just like this was an individual who didn't have a voice, and he spoke poetry whenever he spoke. So I think it was super valuable to document his thinking and his story.
That's so special. Thank you. I think There's something interesting to think about skateboarding community and the use of public space. You know, especially in the Bay Area, space is a huge commodity that is often closed off to those who need it the most. Um, you know, in the case of skateboarding, it often makes it easy to be criminalized just for existing, especially if you are going to be based on your judged based on your skin color. And I think that that leads us to Irene's film and their collaboration with Judge Joelle through Skywatchers. If you want to talk a little bit about how your film thinks about the use of space in San Francisco and why that's significant.
Yeah, I can start, and then Joelle, I'll punt it to you. Yeah, you know, I guess in some ways, like the film also came out of frustration or something. But it was really inspired by Skywatchers, which is an arts ensemble. I had been making a larger film, which was about public space in San Francisco. A little bit about just the quality of public space in the city. You know, San Francisco is a really complicated space of kind of glittering wealth and then pockets of, you know, like neglect. It's a very complicated city, and housing is like such an important issue in the city. And working on those issues, I've been working on them for like 5 or 6 years on a larger film. And the larger film, different parts of it had taken me into the Tenderloin, where I'd been doing a lot of work with different groups and organizations. And that's when I met Skywatchers. And so they had been working for, I think, probably close to a year on hostile architecture. Or unpleasant design, or a project around the kind of architecture or space that is explicitly kind of anti-homeless, anti-loitering kinds of spaces in the city. So they'd been doing research about it. I think they'd been doing some performances, and they'd made a short video. So then I started to collaborate with them on a kind of more broadly kind of conceptualized project, kind of doing sort of amplifying the work that they were already doing, and trying to think about how to make a short documentary that provided some information and analysis, but also used the things that Skywatchers does really well, which is kind of creative intervention, performance, to articulate a set of social problems or concerns, and to kind of talk about the sort of lives that people are living. And so that's how I got involved, and that's how I met Joelle.
Hi, Joelle. Thank you so much for working with Irene so that we could also come across your film and be able to share it with the festival. You want to talk a little bit about your experience, or also maybe give the audience a little bit more context about Skywatchers and why it's important to you? I mean, you do in the film, but.
Art ensemble, it's collaboration of unhoused artists, formerly unhoused artists out of the Tenderloin, San Francisco, and Bay Area artists. And a lot of our work comes from personal history. We pull from our personal history where we have stakes and issues that affect us, such as public space. And we come together and just have a number of conversations. From these conversations, that's where the art comes out of. You know, just in the shared experience, it's able to pinpoint key factors that may be gone unnoticed or swept under the rug. You know, such as the issue of public space. It's something that's in our face every day, and people don't even recognize it. You know, and people that are affected by it, maybe just because it's not something that's spoken forth in society, put it to the backs of their minds and just accept it and try to live within it and under it. And that's something we just try to bring a voice to.
Thank you. It's so special, and I think especially for those of us in the Bay Area who have seen the evolution of time and what the changes, especially after the past 10 or 15 years, have had on the city in terms of the erasure of our community members that need the most support and the most recognition. It's very beautiful to know that there are folks out there that are saying, like, I am here, look at how beautiful I am and the things that I create. And I think that that's something that a good portion of our neighbors in the Bay Area sometimes need help to remember just like how beautiful the humanity is in every single person, not just those that they deem post-meetsable. I'm going to turn that into a verb. So thank you so much. So we're going to pivot over and talk about things that were maybe challenging. I love the concept of that filmmaking is always an opportunity for creative problem solving. Best laid plans can often be complicated, and in those complications, we find new ways to push ourselves and the boundaries of our art. And Lee, if we could start off talking to you, because there's something interesting about not only being an objective filmmaker, but also you're turning this lens on yourself, which is maybe a complication of not only the practicalities of going out and filming in intense situations, but then also being able to be introspective and think about what your legacy with it. And you do dive into some difficult moments within your past and your journey to understanding your own advocacy. And yes, thank you for sharing.
Well, I'm sorry, I need to mention that I worked with a wonderful group, Potential SF, Paul Zara and Eric Ivey and Maren Wickwire, we came together, and originally I didn't really want this to be about me so much, but about the resistance. And they said, no, it has to be about you, and we need to film you, and we're going to come over and interview you. So we co-created it. And I became more and more comfortable with the idea that people would be more interested in hearing the story of somebody who grew up in the 50s in Birmingham, Alabama, and dealt with civil rights and early iterations of that, and then women's rights and gay rights and the environmental movement, and some of those struggles and those challenges and also those successes. So the biggest challenge that we ran into, honestly, Sarah, was I knew that I wanted to do this in January, and then we had COVID, and people stopped going into the streets, and so I thought, oh, we're not going to demonstrate anymore. My film is kind of truncated. And then, we still went forward with it. And then George Floyd's horrid death, and it exploded. The protest at that point before his death had been becoming more and more people closer to my age. And then all of a sudden it was a lot of youth in the streets. And so we got to film during that time, which was such a horrible situation, but it was just a breath of fresh air in terms of the resistance and movement and energy and creativity and passion. So it became a more interesting film with that extra layer of the Black Lives Matter and COVID and the risk that people were taking being in the streets and filming in the streets. So it had a lot of different elements.
Thank you so much for sharing. Brandon, if we could talk a little bit about your way in and maybe challenges. You're working with Mark at a time that his spot is getting blown up, like becoming this huge visual kind of touchstone of movement, which for any artist it has to be in some ways confusing or difficult when you have but also very exciting also, but when you have so much of you shared so quickly. If you could talk about any challenges that you faced in creating legacy.
Yeah, there was quite a few challenges we faced in the creating of legacy. So initially, when I hit Mark up about this idea of this project, he was like, "Okay, cool, yeah, let's do it." But I had to wait 2 months until he had the availability to do it, because he went months. It was for him, it was a blessing and a curse at the same time. He went months without working because of the pandemic, to suddenly everybody wanting him. So his time at that point became a currency, and it was more so about, all right, I want to do this. You guys are cool. You seem cool. But I just don't have the time right now. Like I'm capitalizing as much as I can on this moment. But we're going to find the time. So it was us being patient, waiting for him to find the time for us. And when he did, then we had to curate the time ourselves. because we wanted to do it right then in that moment. He didn't, so we had to like wait 2 months for it to happen, while also still maintaining the inspiration for this project. Because when you're inspired to create, you want to create right now, not a week later, not a month later, necessarily. So it was making sure that we was able to maintain that momentum. And when we went into the project, we wanted it to be a very personal piece. We wanted to talk about who he was and how this this tragedy, this murder, affected him and his life. And we also wanted to talk about his family and how that impacted them. And there was resistance at first for that. He just was, I just wanted to, I don't know you guys like that. I just wanted let's keep it focused on me. Let's keep it focused on me. But through those conversations, we talked to him for hours on it. Like one day turned into like a whole week worth of conversation. He started to understand who we were and understand where we were coming from and how we wanted to honor him and his work and the movement that we all were a part of. And so he opened up the floodgates. He says, "You know what? You want to meet my wife? This is my daughter. This is my mom." And it just allowed us to evolve the story in an organic and naturalistic way that we wanted from the get-go. And it became a pleasant surprise where at the end, when we revealed the final film to him, his mother and his grandmother, they cried when they saw it because they just were so in awe of their son and their grandson and proud of the work he was doing and proud of us for like being able to shed a spotlight on him and the movement that he was Black Lives Matter.
Thank you so much. I think it's like such a great point to just think about what importance it is when we're able to capture stories and have the ability to share them. And I think that with that is also a huge responsibility. And Joseph, I think it's interesting because you said that Eric actually sought you out, which, sometimes you would hear about this in the reverse more often than not. So what was that like for you in terms of deciding to create this collaboration and really dive into something for Eric that is so personal, but also so very universal feelings that are felt by lots of, particularly men, but people of color who are dealing with the consequences of not always being recognized for who they are and being profiled and abused?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's interesting to hear Brandon's experience, like building rapport with his character, and that being kind of like the biggest hurdle as far as getting access and stuff. And I think for me, my experience was a little bit different because I spent like 2 years with Eric, just getting to know him and developing a relationship before we had even decided to embark and, recreate and tell his sort of traumatic experience. So I think it would have been really difficult to develop that relationship if I had just met him and immediately, that's where we were headed. But our relationship was really a friendly one where we would just hang out with each other. I would document him, and in hanging out with him, you'd just get these nuggets of truth and wisdom that he just gives to people unsolicited, but I think the difficulty came when it came time to, be really vulnerable and recreate his experience in a cinematic way. That was what I struggle with the most is, as a filmmaker, we try to recreate reality. Obviously we can't match the actual experience. So we try to create heightened forms of recreations that'll portray those emotions or give someone a sense of an idea of what it was like to be in that position. And I was dealing with something that I've obviously never dealt with before. I mean, I've never been profiled to be a skateboarder or been the subject of police brutality. So I really had to figure out what I was comfortable in sort of portraying in that situation. And also, obviously, Eric led the way. You know, he spoke very candidly and openly and unapologetically about his experiences, and I think that allowed us to kind of be stark in our recreation and not shy away from some of the things. So I was really lucky, you know, to have such a well sort of or such a vulnerable subject that was ready to tell this story, because I really feel like he was guiding the whole process and I was just kind of taking my expertise as a filmmaker and trying to, you know, and capture that story in a way that people you know, that communicates what happened. But yeah, I would say definitely the hardest part was when it came to, you know, like recalling the traumatic moments, because obviously those are really difficult to talk about and difficult to recreate in a visual way that both does them justice, but also doesn't, you know, glorify violence or do anything sort of too strongly, I guess. And then I guess like the last difficult thing was like, I think a lot of people who make documentaries probably feel this way, is like, when is your story over? When does the film end? I had been working with Eric for 2 years, and you know, it was just hard to know when to sort of put a bow in it and say like, this is done, because someone's real life, their life doesn't sort of have the same plot points as like a movie story. So yeah, I think I still kind of struggle with that, but I think, you know, what we did in telling that story and where he's going now is that kind of made sense in the end. But those are definitely the biggest hurdles that I faced.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, that's an interesting point when you think about documentary form or filmmaking form in general, you know. The camera turns off and cuts in a moment in time, but there's so much story that could even be seen if you decided to turn the camera just a quarter of an inch a different direction. You know, everything's always mediated by somebody's eye. It's shot by somebody's eye. It's edited by somebody's eye. So it's a truth, but not all of the truth, which must be interesting when you invite somebody to come into your world and mediate that truth. And I was wondering, Joel, if you could talk a little bit about what it was like working with Irene and having your story be shared.
I actually was just thinking about that. I was thinking about the aspect because majority of the documentary you see is actually filmed in public space. Um, some in a congested space, somewhere you see a lot of people in transport, some in secluded spaces, and at times there's different elements that could actually be distracted, and I found myself I had to just be centered, you know what I'm saying, and focus on what the message was, and that, you know what I'm saying, the gravity of what we're speaking, and I guess by just drawing on the energy of the other performers, you know, we're focused on this collective purpose. That energy went forth and it actually drew outside people from what they're doing into what we're doing. Um, at times we go to spaces, you know, everything was filmed actually in the Tenderloin, and you know, spaces where basically people have been pushed to, and I guess out of like a little defiance for their lack of power, they claim the space and they do whatever they want within the space, whether it's legal or illegal. And so I know when we first came on the space, we those felt kind of like we were trespassing, but our focus and our desire, you know, won out. And you see amongst the different clusters, there's people actually glued into what we're doing and forgetting their own world. And at times people came over and asked about what we're about and what we're doing. Um, in other spaces where we're just enjoying the space, you know, on the cusp of the pandemic, right before the lockdown, you see people joining in and celebrating. You see people lifting their heads up out of monotony, wondering what was going on, and just, you know, a look of just amazement, like, wow, just like something extra in their lives. Uh, just in working further on this art, like I said, it helped me just to go review my history and look how this issue has affected me. You know, bring focus to spaces and experiences that I hadn't realized was part of this issue. It helped to bring this issue back to the history and just to see, saying the grounds for everything that's involved and the motivation, um, and just understanding the size of it. Uh, I guess too, it helped me just to put in words things I maybe didn't realize was actually there.
Can I add one thing to what Joelle just said?
Yes, please. Sorry, I was on mute. I was about to.
And it
Irene.
sort of ties into stuff that Joseph said and in some ways what Brandon said and ETA as well. Is like, I think what inspired me or kind of drew me to Skywatchers in some ways, and it's a little bit in what Joelle is saying about how we went into these public spaces to transform them through the sort of process of showing up and filming. And I think that, that has always been in some ways my approach to documentary as well, is I'm unsatisfied with what is. And so I want to use documentary language to summon kind of what could be, or that we can actually, that reality isn't something just to acknowledge or capture, but it is through the acts of filming or performance or creating realities that we can summon different kinds of futures, different kinds of sensibilities, different kinds of analytics, and that documentary is an important language for doing that. And I think what, Joelle was talking about that Skywatchers does is they do that through performance as well, And so trying to address a question like the experience of being unhoused and living in public space, that the way to sort of think about that and represent it is not to turn a camera on people who are unhoused, but rather to think about it through analytics and poetry and movement and vision, right? To sort of acknowledge that this reality exists and then to try to figure out a way to reimagine it.
That's a really special way of thinking about it. And I think that this is a nice way to turn it over to ETA when you talk about the language of cinema, and how much nuance change the way that you're expressing yourself or accessing a narrative. And ETA, I think it's really interesting when you talk about the way that your access to storytelling is in defiance of kind of Western narrative structure, especially as you're shining a light on very specific artistic spaces that don't often have a lot of visibility when you talk about the API experience. When you talk about communities of artists that are telling stories that are not always conforming in a way that folks tend to look for. But in doing that, you're able to spotlight the beautiful ways of accessing things from different perspectives. So if you could talk about your work and how, maybe it's challenging to come into these spaces and say, we're going to do something new or something different, or what those collaborative moments were like for you.
Sure. Yeah, it was challenging, especially in the editing room, because there was this push and pull between trying to be defiant and making something that was more Eastern, maybe more Buddhistic, and slower paced, but also not wanting to isolate or alienate audiences. So the original cut is actually 30 minutes, and it's very sleepy, and it's very tranquil, and there's a lot of spaces in between the anecdotes and the conversations and voices shared. So trimming that down and trying to synthesize the essence of it while making it accessible was a really challenging part of the experience. But I think for me, having that pacing and being able to settle into something that was healing for me, and then having these beautiful voices articulate their experiences and relating to them was a process that helped me find my voice and see the different lenses of which I relate to, and kind of really flesh out my experiences as well.
Thank you so much. That is just about all the time we have for our Q&A, but I just want to say again, thank you all so much for sharing your stories and letting us share them with our festival. It's so important to think and remember how resilient we are, and how we're coming into a new age of new beginnings and new awarenesses. And I think that stories like this really help to pinpoint that. So thank you so much for being with us today. Bye-bye, audience. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Can't wait to watch all your films.